So yes, thank you so much for joining us for this session on Europe's security and defence, land, sea and cyberspace. My name is Cian FitzGerald. I'm one of the senior researchers here at the IIEA, leading our work on defence and national security. Since 2022, Europe's security environment has deteriorated quite rapidly since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, increased amounts of hybrid attacks, sabotage, espionage, as well as the threat of a full-scale conflagration in Europe. At the same time, the European Union has published its white paper for defence readiness last year in 2025, which outlines how Europe can be prepared for its ambition for Europe to be prepared for a full-scale conflict by 2030. Ireland's presidency comes at a key point in this during the MFF negotiations, and so to discuss all of this and how Europe can be better able to protect itself and its citizens, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Mellett, Chair of the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority and also former Chief of Staff of the Irish Defence Forces, Margaret Stanley, Director of the Maritime Security Unit at Ireland's Department of Defence and one of the lead authors of Ireland's first maritime security strategy. And congratulations again, Margaret. It's an incredible achievement. Tony Lawrence, Head of Policy and Strategy Programme at the International Centre for Defence and Security in Estonia, and Jessica Larsen, Senior Researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies. So we're going to run until about 11:15, and I'll invite our speakers to give some opening thoughts for about 5 minutes, if that's okay with everyone, and then we'll go to Q&A with the audience. So Mark, I might invite you to come in first.
Thanks very much. Cian helped me with a paper there about a year ago now, and what's past is prologue, and Barry, you helped me too. But I suppose what I took from that was a perspective of if you want to know where you are or where you're going, you need to know where you came from. And in 1921, Article 6 of the Treaty on Independence said that until we had the wherewithal to provide for our own coastal defence, it would be provided by His Majesty's Imperial Forces. And so be it. That was a time when we had very little resources, but it institutionalized, in my view, a mindset towards the maritime that has carried through for decades, and indeed up to recently, it has resulted in very little spend on defence in this country. And when I talk about maritime, it's not just maritime, it's maritime and the domains around it in terms of air, obviously space, and obviously more recently cyber. But we didn't always have, I suppose, a lower priority on maritime. If you go back to the 1600s with the pirate queen, Grania Whale, she ravaged the West Coast and others in terms of her piracy. So she knew the power in terms of the maritime. And I think it's interesting just to know the motto of the O'Malley clan, which is Terra Mari Potens, power by land and sea. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. So just moving up to, I suppose, where we are today, I always say that state security is inextricably linked with economic security, which is inextricably linked to energy security. And if you take that trilogy and then move it into the maritime space, you can see that our tech success is very much driven by, let's say, critical underwater infrastructure like our fiber optic cables that drive that tech economy. Almost $1 trillion of business a day is done through the very cables coming in through our jurisdiction that lie on the seabed where we have sovereignty or sovereign rights. If you look at our energy connectors, this country, our baseload is completely almost dependent on energy interconnectors from the UK and also from the, I suppose, the declining resource in the Corrib field, where about 20% comes there. Our trade, 90% by volume, comes in by sea, our fisheries. And I often make the argument because people say the fish in our sea belong to the European Union. Actually, they're not. They belong to the citizens of this jurisdiction. When they're caught in accordance with the institutions of the Common Fisheries Policy and the EU, there is a transfer of property right at that point. But the obligation to protect that resource remains, I think, a national obligation. And then we have the offshore renewable energy opportunity, an extraordinary opportunity. We have the richest accessible offshore renewable energy resource on the planet. And I say that with a degree of confidence because it's accessible to centres of population, not just in Ireland, but in Europe. There are other areas in the world, like to the west of Canada, but nobody lives there. There's on top of the Himalayas, there's plenty of wind there, but nobody lives there either. And to the east of Japan, there's quite significant offshore renewable, but the sea is 3,000 meters deep. Just moving on then to just staying on that point, I'm looking forward to phase one, the first two decisions from the on board Panola, Commission Panola for the East Coast. That will be the first two, I suppose, projects that will revitalise our offshore renewable energy sector since the vision, I suppose, that Eddie O'Connor had back in 2002 with regards to the Arklow Branch. So from that, we can see electrification of our grid, greater security in terms of a grid, but also the potentiality of a surplus. So we're talking about 37 gigawatts, which is government policy. 37 gigawatts, we need about 7 gigawatts for our national grid. We can electrify, perhaps produce green hydrogen that can drive the creation of sustainable aviation fuel, e-fuels. Ryanair alone could consume about 7 gigawatts of renewable energy for green hydrogen, and that would keep that fleet moving from a renewable point of view. And there is also the opportunity to have energy parks and all that goes with that. And back to data centres, of course, we can sustain that key centre of gravity of our tech industry in terms of that renewable and green compute into the future. But, and this is the but, we are in the middle of a hybrid war. There's no ifs or buts about it. It didn't start yesterday. It started actually about 10 years ago. And I remember being involved when I was head of the Navy with the spill off the west coast of 300 to 500 tons of oil from the Russian aircraft carrier Kuznetsov. And that vessel sat in this large plume of oil saying, it was here when we got here, and yet there was I suppose an oiler beside him, fueling him. And it just shows the arrogance that we've lived with. Since then you've had the actual creation of our espionage, open source espionage in terms of the likes of Prokopiev, a Russian agent who ran freely in this country for a number of years until he was PNG'd. We had the creation or the attempt to expand Orwell Road in terms of the embassy by 500%. We had the government moved and restricted that. We've had the attack on the HSE, the extraordinary attack on the HSE, which I don't think was ever really acknowledged to the extent of the aggression institutions of civil society. The most vulnerable people in our community were actually were challenged by that attack. It was extraordinary. And just to say that the state had nothing to do with it is extraordinary. It happened from a criminal gang in Russian Sovereign Federation. It is a reality, a state-sponsored attack. I remember in the military committee, and I sat there for 6 years, we also looked at, the risk from a Russian task force to the west of Ireland. And we saw that very issue arise in the weeks leading up to the Ukraine invasion, where a Russian task group decided they were going to, I suppose, sanitize 5,000 square kilometres of our economic zone for 5 days, an area the size of Wicklow, Wexford and Dublin, that Ireland fishermen and others could not use that space in our economic zone. It was just extraordinary. And I think while, it was misinterpreted by some that the fishermen did a great job, the reality was it was a demonstration of undermining the institutions of government in this jurisdiction. For Russia to become stronger, all that needs to happen is Europe to become weaker. And we have more recently the actual activities of the Yantar. And I'm coming towards a close now. So what are we doing? Well, we had the Commission on Defence, and out of that we have our Defence Forces, I should say. Out of that we have our levels of ambition, and I'm hoping we're driving towards level 2, and maybe Margaret will be able to comment on that at maximum speed. But we can't have a dash for trash. We have to build that capability in terms of people and hardware. We also have acquired certain orders in terms of capabilities and sonar and radar on the horizon. We've increased our bilaterals with the UK and with our nearest EU neighbour, France. And we're moving with the prioritisation of security in our presidency, which is. We've also established MARA, which is the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority, to drive forward in terms of the maximum and, I suppose, sustainable use of our maritime area. And it's also just important to link with that, the ambition towards our protected areas by 2030, 30% of our jurisdiction, because the real stabilizer of climate change is our ocean. 90% of the excess heat is absorbed by the ocean. 30% of the excess carbon is absorbed by the ocean. We wouldn't be having this conversation today were it not for the ocean. So the protection of biodiversity is going to be a critical piece. It's a critical part of security. So I come back to Terra Marie Potens. The future is that we could have power by land and sea. It's all up to us to manage it efficiently and effectively. Thank you. Thanks,
Mark. I am particularly struck by your comments of the arrogance of not dealing with hybrid threats, and maybe we can talk a bit more about this. But next, I'm going to go to Margaret Stanley. The floor is yours.
So as you mentioned at the beginning, Cian, we recently launched Ireland's first national maritime security strategy. And I suppose I might comment on the reason for our focus on maritime strategy first was because of the assessed threat level, our geographic position, but also our responsibility to support the security and defence of the rest of Europe. So I think it's kind of very important to kind of situate it in that space. So for the past, all through 2025, myself and my team were developing and preparing this strategy. And I think a key element of that preparation were visits and outreach to various international institutions, neighbouring countries, equivalent organisations to ourselves across the European Union. And that provided us huge opportunities and insight to understand how other countries deal with maritime security, the lessons they've learned through their own processes and best practices as well. So that kind of allowed us maybe to take a wider view on, well, you know, can we consider what's best from an Irish perspective? So I would say kind of a huge thank you to across the EU for the willingness to share those types of insights in our own process. So that resulted then in our minister's launch earlier this year of as I said, our first national maritime security strategy. And essentially what the aim of this ultimately is to do is to create a secure and sovereign Ireland where our people and interests are protected and where our European and international neighbours can rely on us to uphold the rule of law in the maritime domain. So this is quite an ambitious goal. You know, we're starting from a small base, I'm sure, as Mark will acknowledge. So we're very keen now to work very, very quickly on actually implementing this strategy and to ensure we can implement it as well. Rather than creating a standalone strategy, we also created an accompanying action plan, which identifies how to actually achieve this ambitious goal. And we have specific objectives as well within the strategy to help us along the way, including strengthening our relationships with across the EU, with international organisations, with our near neighbours. And this will include things like, I think you briefly mentioned this in your opening remarks, Mark, our minister can recently agreed a new joint strategic framework with France up to 2030. She also signed, with her opposite numbers now, sadly resigned, but in the UK, which refreshed Ireland's Memorandum of Understanding on Defence and Security Matters with the UK Ministry of Defence. So both of these new agreements essentially allow for a very specific focus on maritime security, which we can now take forward in practical, concrete ways. And I suppose, again, kind of what's the risk behind it? Why are we so focused on this? Again, Mark very eloquently talked about the Russian threat. You know, this is essentially kind of a growing concern for us in Ireland, but also across the EU and again, our near neighbours too. So kind of practical measures we're doing like that now. Ireland is now, for example, participating in Nordic-Baltic 8++ meetings, which allows for, you know, sharing information and understanding of how to deal with this new and evolving threat, and to understand, you know, from others, you know, the types of measures that are taken, and to, you know, to be able to, you know, talk in frank ways about this matter. We're also doing things like currently pushing through urgent maritime security related legislation through our parliamentary process. We you know, as I mentioned, this outreach we took place last year. We had very kind of useful conversations with, say, people working on this topic, for example, in France and others. So we had or in Norway as well, where we got a really good sense of, you know, you can increase all the capability you want, but if you don't have the legislative backing to work within the very complex legal space that is the maritime domain, it makes for a very difficult situation to actually make major progress. So that's why my minister is working very diligently at the moment in our parliament to get this new legislation, which will give certain powers to our defence forces when they're operating at sea to deal with things like the shadow fleet and the potential threat that they pose to our critical undersea infrastructure. And maybe just a brief word about that infrastructure. You know, again, because of our geographic position, we're very aware that there's very significant undersea infrastructure in our waters. Some of it lands on our shores, but much of it traverses through our exclusive economic zone and is critical for our neighbouring countries. So we understand we have a very big responsibility there, considering that there's a considerable percentage of global internet traffic, financial information that flows through these cables. Also, as an island country, our energy sector very much relies on the critical undersea infrastructure that supports our electricity grid, for example. So there's all sorts of reasons why we see our responsibility to step up in this maritime space. And then maybe just a very brief word then on the presidency, which will be arriving quite imminently now. If I was going to describe what our priorities are from a maritime security point of view when it comes to the presidency, I would say, that because of the importance we attach to critical maritime infrastructure, critical undersea infrastructure, we do see maritime security as a priority issue during our presidency. We also, of course, want to contribute to kind of EU-wide efforts to deal with maritime challenges and threats, such as the shadow fleet. And of course, we're very aware that the midterm review of the European Union's maritime security strategy is taking place during the period when we'll have the presidency. So we very much want to support that and make sure that's a successful review. So I might leave that there for the moment.
Super. Thanks, Margaret. I might go to you, Jessica, just as you're next in the queue. So
absolutely.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I think that was a perfect segue to my talk, which will be on the EU as a maritime security actor, because much is changing these years and it affects what we can do about emerging threats. So maritime security is vital for the EU's economic growth, for our supply chains, and also for EU strategic autonomy. And indeed, the EU has come out as a maritime security provider in recent decades. So in its external action, it has used a civil military toolbox to do capacity building, crisis management, promote international law and multilateralism, and support peace and stabilization. Now, remembering history, the CFSP and the CSDP were developed in the 1990s. And this was a time when the Western world was setting the agenda and where liberal peace and liberal democracy were kind of the global goal, and we were all reaping the benefits of the peace dividend after the Cold War. And here the EU's crisis management toolbox was a perfect match for the EU's identity as a peace project, which was how it began after the Second War. And also it matched the nature of security challenges at the time at sea, where piracy off the coast of Africa was kind of the main challenge. But today, as my fellow panelists have already been talking about, also Europe's own waters are facing threats in the shape of geopolitical competition and various types of hybrid threats. So the shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea, cyber attacks, sabotage, jamming and spoofing, geopolitical tensions in the Arctic and the global north, the high north, military strikes in the Baltic Sea, smuggling through European ports. We all know it from reading the news. So threats are firstly shifting or perhaps expanding geographically from external action to Europe's own waters. And in this expansion, we also see how threats are secondly hardening. So from crime, such as piracy, to now also being hybrid warfare. This development has been reflected in EU strategy. Again, we all know it. In 2016, the Global Strategy on Foreign and Security Policy came. And with this followed a flurry of activity with the activation of PESCO and CARD and the military planning and conduct capability, DG DEFIS, the European Defence Fund, the European Defence Facility, the Strategic Compass for Security, defense, the EU Hybrid Toolbox, and then the Readiness Plan 2030, just to mention some of the initiatives coming out of Brussels over the past decade. This sort of bouquet of security initiatives, hard security initiatives, mind you, means that the existing internal structures to deal with maritime security as defined in the EU Maritime Security Strategy, for instance, EMSA, for instance, Frontex, the European Fisheries Control Agency, Agency for Cybersecurity, Europol, CISA, which is EMSA's Common Information Sharing Environment, and the Civil Protection Mechanism. All these existing internal structures are now joined by new initiatives that carry a more conventional, hard security logic. And this leads me to some implications, and I present them here as questions because questions are handy working tools when we're shaping policy. So question, how do we ensure correspondence between strategy and operations? So strategic autonomy seems a given by now, and security is moving fast in Brussels, not to mention member states. We are producing, we are procuring, we are developing new policies to face new emerging threats, both internally and externally to the EU. We have the European Ocean Pact, which sets up the single strategic framework for all EU ocean-related policy actions. But while these new initiatives are pointing to strategic autonomy and dealing with hybrid threats against European security, the EU's maritime security operations are largely external to the EU. And this is, of course, logical. So security is a national prerogative, and the EU is not planning a sort of maritime security operation inside the EU anytime soon. But what then exactly is the EU's role in addressing European security, also vis-a-vis NATO? So in other words, it will be important to retain a focus on how to translate these policy initiatives and strategies and concepts on an EU level into practice. Our adversaries are watching and our legitimacy is at stake. A related question, how do we ensure institutional interlinkages? So with the current proliferation of strategies that I mentioned and the complex security threat landscape facing the EU, both internally and externally, well, they reach across different policy domains and also different EU bodies. So how to avoid overlaps, redundancy, gaps, also how to facilitate inclusive policymaking that reach all the way from stakeholders in the civil society community or civil society organizations, which are really an important stakeholder, to, let's say, European intelligence agencies and relevant actors in between. Another question relates to public-private partnerships. When it comes to maritime security, the shipping industry, the maritime sector, fisheries, they are often the victim. Think of piracy, think of cyber attacks, and sometimes they also risk weaponization. Think of the shadow fleet tankers, think of the shipyards that are implementing sanctions. And here, public-private partnerships will be really important in finding sustainable solutions and also implementing them. Finally, zooming out, the basis for our prosperity in the EU is maritime security, as I said in the beginning, or an important factor at least. And the basis for attaining this is science. The more we know, the more we can do, and the better we can protect the oceans. We need data. We need forecasts and projections. We need innovation and technological development. And to reach this goal, we need dialogue between academia, business, policymakers, and European citizens. Granted, I didn't formulate this as a question, but a demand we need. But I think being at a research institute, I'm sure you agree with me that science is important. So to recap, correspondence between strategy and operations, ensuring institutional interlinkages, public-private partnerships, and research and dialogue between academia, public actors, and civil society. I think these are some of the working questions, or let's say operational enablers, that are important to focus on when it comes to the EU addressing maritime security in a sustainable and effective manner in the years to come. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm a really big fan of your image of the bouquet of security instruments. I think it's a really nice way to kind of frame all of the assets at the European Union. I can also see a really nice cover for a paper. So I'll turn to you, Tony, if you'd like.
Thank you, Cian, and thanks to the organisers for the opportunity to be here. It's a real pleasure. My first visit to Dublin, and I shall certainly be coming back. So I'm going to continue with the maritime theme. I'm a defence person, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about how we might construct a military-based deterrence against the sort of critical underwater infrastructure incidents we've seen in our region, in the Baltic region, over the past few years. Just to summarise very quickly what that was all about. So between late 2023 and early 2025, we had 4 major incidents in the Baltic Sea in which commercial vessels dragged their anchors across the seabed and severed a total of 14 data, electricity and gas pipelines. And this pattern and the fact that a lot of it happened in a very short time period really pointed to the fact that this was almost certainly a Russian hybrid campaign. NATO is often somewhat hesitant about becoming involved in hybrid warfare, but in this case, it did agree to launch a mission in the Baltic Sea, or strictly it's called an enhanced vigilance activity. It's called Baltic Sentry, and that has seen warships present in the Baltic Sea for the last year and a half. The incidents quickly dropped off, although at the end of 2025, we did have another incident in which 2 data cables between Finland and Estonia were also cut. These incidents are disruptive and they're expensive. I mean, I know that my own electricity bills shot up rather quickly after they happened in 2023. And the states of the Baltic region have been looking for ways to deter them. This is partly a legal question, it's partly an economic question, but there's also a kind of a military and paramilitary component, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. What we're trying to do is to demonstrate to the adversary that we can deny him the benefits he expects from launching attacks against us. And I'm going to use just illustrate that with 4 components of what I think might be included in this posture. So the first is maritime situation awareness. This is our ability to see what's going on and also to be able to attribute the incidents to malicious actors. In the Baltic region, our common maritime picture is much better than it was, particularly since Finland and Sweden joined NATO. But it's there's still certainly some room for improvement here. And a lot of the focus today is on technology. Under Baltic Sentry in the Baltic Sea, there are various activities that are looking at how uncrewed systems might be used to complement maritime situation awareness. There are also activities going on to look at how AI might be used, for example, to spot anomalies in large data sets. The second deterrent component, because deterrence involves a lot of signalling, it's still important that we have vessels present, as in our own vessels present on the Baltic Sea, so warships, Coast Guard vessels and the like. This is also an area where we tend to lack capability. There's just simply aren't enough military vessels to do the job that needs to be done in our region, but also in NATO more widely. And it's important, you know, as we rearm Europe, that we don't neglect the maritime domain as well. Not least because naval and Coast Guard vessels are, you know, the way we get options for responses. So harassment, escort, attack if necessary, boarding. And demonstrating the ability to do this is this kind of third component of a deterrence posture for the Baltics, for the maritime domain. And the fourth, less tangible requirement is for more cooperation. So international, interagency, private, public. And this is about plugging holes, and it's about presenting a united front as part of our deterrence messaging. As these incidents grew in the Baltic Sea in the past few years, I think that the affected states began to work together more strongly, and they began to inch their way towards shared concepts for how to deal with this kind of incident and other suspicious activities. But that's been quite fragile. And Russia's sometimes aggressive responses to our efforts have perhaps reduced our willingness to take the kind of actions that we need to take. So deterrence, you know, works both ways. Another approach that you might take to deterrence is to signal that you're going to punish any adversary who launches an attack on you. I mentioned this because in the Nordic-Baltic area, there's a certain growing frustration about the Russia getting away with far too much. It's arrogant behavior. And with that comes this kind of wish to do more, to be more robust in our response. In that kind of approach, questions of proportionality, questions of a risk of escalation, questions of attribution are really much more important than they otherwise would be. And I think that means it's going to be very difficult to find consensus to do that kind of deterrent posture in our region, but more so in NATO more widely. So what we're left with is a continuing need to enhance our deterrence by denial posture, which means more capability investment. It means more detection capability, more response capability, and it needs more working together in order to develop these shared concepts and shared understandings. And I hope, I mean, we have for many years, for 75 years, collectivized our response to conventional military attack. We really ought to be collectivizing our response to hybrid attack as well.
Thanks, Tony. I'm wondering if I can be a little bit provocative. I think before I go to the audience, I think this is going to be a little bit. I'm hoping to kind of start a little bit of a discussion. But one of the things that we've seen, I mean, before 2020, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, has been this kind of asymmetric force projection by Russia. Really, really focusing on the hybrid. I mean, obviously we see the military exercises in 2022 off the Irish coast, or the planned military exercises, this proliferation of cyber attacks. And it seems to be that the emphasis for a long time in terms of countering hybrid attacks has been what you mentioned, attribution, which I know is one part of what you were highlighting. But I get the sense sometimes that it's like, well, we've attributed it and we're sort of done now. But the Russians don't care. Fundamentally, they don't care. They're undeterred by this type of attribution. And all the while, when we have incidents such as cable cuts or data cable cuts or gas pipeline cuts, the private sector sort of has to bear those costs, and they have to deal with rising insurance premiums and risks of things becoming uninsurable because of war risks. And increasingly, and like this ties in a little bit to the public-private partnerships bit, a little bit, where where the private sector feels that the government is maybe being a little bit too overbearing in terms of providing more, you're requiring more redundancy, increasing costs for them, while also not providing the security capabilities to defend this infrastructure in the first place. And I think that really presents an obstacle, because I think the state and the private sector seem to read geopolitical risk a little bit differently. So I'm just a little bit interested in, kind of how can we meaningfully deter, and I'd like to build up a little bit on what Tony, you're talking about, just a little bit, how do you meaningfully deter kind of Russia in the hybrid space? And then just how do we kind of build those public-private partnerships when often it's society who has to deal with the consequences of these types of hybrid attacks? Tony, I might go back to you first, and then we can kind of come back this way, if that's all right.
Sure. Let me just kind of slightly challenge the premise of the question, or as part of the question.
Perfect.
So when you say that Russia is not deterred and Russia doesn't care what we think, I think that's not entirely true. I mean, I think they value having a certain amount of plausible deniability in their actions against us. I mean, it's not warships sailing down the Baltic Sea cutting cables. It's commercial vessels that have links to Russia, for example, through the Shadow Fleet. So and the fact that this is something they can portray as an accident is also part of that plausible deniability. So I think it's not entirely true that they're not deterred at all. But this is a really difficult question. I mean, hybrid warfare is a fairly new phenomenon, at least in the way it's conducted now. And it's the real challenge, I think, is building cohesion amongst the allies as to how we respond to this, because we all see things very differently. It's broadly true, I think, that the further to the south and the west you go on a continent, the less likely you'll find people are ready to accept that Russia is an existential threat to any of us. The other way around, the further you go to the north and the east, the more ready you'll find people willing to take a more robust response to Russia's actions. In the Baltic region, we hear this all the time. We only need to do this once and they won't do it to us again. But, consensus, I think, is vital, and we have to try and build that consensus and maintain that consensus, and that stands in the way of these more robust actions. On public-private partnerships, I think in the Baltic Sea region, we've done okay with this recently, again, as a response to these attacks, that the operators are working much more closely with the governments. There's a difficult question, and it's certainly not a resolved question, about who is responsible for this. I mean, it can't just be the operators, because these are national security, this is national security infrastructure. So the state has to have some kind of role in this. There's an interesting story in the papers a few weeks ago that Russia has required the banks in Moscow to take responsibility for their own air and missile defense, which is quite a development. I don't think we're heading in that direction. But certainly at the same time, you can't have the operators making large profits and not taking any responsibility at all. And they have capabilities that we don't. They have surveillance and sea surveillance capabilities which can be used to build this overall comprehensive picture.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the moral hazard, right? Which is at the same time, you can't necessarily leave the private sector entirely on its own. In case the expectation that the state would come to its aid if it didn't invest in its security. But then there's also the requirement to make them invest. Jessica, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, attribution is a huge issue in the case of hybrid threats, and so we might be able to point to Russia, but is it the Russian state or is it Russian private actors? And that really changes how we. Because do we want to then attack Russia? Maybe not. Do we? Good luck getting the private actors out of Russia if we want to. Because in the best of all world, deterrent, like legal finish, would be a great deterrent effect. Hopefully, prosecuting. But I think there's a question about cable sovereignty as well, because the cables are privately owned, but then who protects them, who repairs them? The repair ships are also, I think we have some European cable laying companies, maybe also repair ships. We need more of them, and they could also be attacked. There's a lot of sort of sensitive flanks. But cable sovereignty, I think, is a huge issue because it really also defines who has responsibility over what. I was talking about cable sabotage in the Baltic Sea once, and to kind of shortcut, I asked ChatGPT who has ratified, or which countries have not ratified the Cable Convention from 1884, because this is the most recent legislation we have on cable security. And ChatGPT answered that one of the countries that had not ratified the convention was the Ottoman Empire. And I think this tells us where we are on international law in terms of dealing with this. But yeah, attribution is a issue. Cable sovereignty we need to deal with. And then the legal finish side of things is really a tricky issue when it comes to hybrid threats.
Yeah, I think also one of the challenges that's emerged, at least when I've been working on subsea cables and my maritime security, is that there's so many different actors in this space. You've got the cable repair companies, you've got the cable laying companies, you've got the cable operators and owners, and it's so dense. And so trying to read into it as maybe a policy person is really challenging, and that presents challenges for government who are trying to get up to speed, and I think that they are. So with that, I might turn to our government official, Margaret. If you have any thoughts.
Well, I suppose from the experience from preparing the strategy is that there's no end to the complexity of the maritime domain. There's no end to the sea, is how I would put it. So absolutely, no one country can deal with all of this complexity alone, even if we didn't have this very difficult geopolitical situation, which is constantly deteriorating. Even if that was settled, we'd still need support and help from others to try and deal with what's happening at sea. So certainly greater cooperation in countries amongst institutions is very important. And I totally agree this importance of public-private cooperation, because much of the critical undersea infrastructure that we're so concerned about and that our societies rely on is owned and operated by the private sector. So industry absolutely has a part to play in this, and certainly in our own kind of national strategy that is acknowledged. And as part of our contribution to the upcoming presidency in my department, we are looking to develop a maritime security related conference in Dublin in the autumn, which we're thinking the theme is a dialogue with industry, where we bring together government, military, the owners and operators, academia, to have frank conversations about this and consider new ways of working together. So that's something we're working on at the moment, but it is, again, complex and difficult to try and organize such a thing and make sure the right people are in the room to talk about the right topics.
Is there a role for exercises in that? Aiming?
Well, I'm not sure for the conference specifically, just
in general.
But in general, absolutely. That would be another point I was going to mention. That I think it's a great way of encouraging cooperation. By the nature of exercise, you get everybody in the same room together to talk about the same topic, and that builds relationships over time, and you can increase the complexity of these exercises over time as well. So I think Ireland, through the strategy, has a way into maybe getting involved in more concrete ways with EU-wide maritime security-related exercises. So I think that's something over the course of the next number of years we really will be pursuing, and it's something we have hope to have a lot of gain from.
Super. Thanks, Margaret. Mark.
Yeah, well, just picking up on that last point, I think Margaret was absolutely right. I often say, how do you integrate institutions? You do things together. And by the way, that can be military forces doing things together. That's not a threat to our military non-alignment. You know, to be a better force, you need to train with others, you know, who are, you know, as good as you or better than you to improve your techniques, your tactics and procedures. And that's a norm. So, you know, the more exercises we can have bilaterally, multilaterally, the better. And we can still be sovereign with regards to our non-alignment of our military forces. But I think to come back to the opening point on Russia, Russia only respects strength. It devours weakness. It devours weakness. And, you know, the suggestion we could appease Russia, forget it. The reality is that it is actually pushing the boundaries on institutions. Margaret, you mentioned about strengthening, you know, some of our legal frameworks for the defence forces and the utility there. Like the Law of the Sea, I think it was Sir Alan Beasley, who was the chairman of the drafting committee back in the late 70s, early 80s, said it was in a state of disorder bordering on chaos. But that's the last main drafting we've had, you know, notwithstanding the cables legislation, which was hundreds of years before that. We do need to come back into that space again to look at how states are actually playing, you know, fast and loose with international institutions, with a shadow fleet, avoiding sanctions, going on vessels that are barely certified, if not certified at all. The pose a huge challenge to states. And I think what we also need to do, come back to my earlier point about we're in a full-scale hybrid war, we need to start engaging in hybrid literacy so civil society can understand what's happening. When you have polarization through bots and trolls from an address in St. Petersburg that are fanning flames of xenophobia, creating and strengthening the far right to try and undermine not just, if you like, civil society, but democratic institutions, we need to take action. Civil society and international law, human rights and freedom are built on institutions that function correctly. But if they're being targeted by, you know, a state or states, then the citizen needs to know that so that we can actually counter it. And some people won't be, you know, drawn. Actually, I saw a shadow of that during the fuel protests here in this country, the way it actually escaped. I have absolute sympathy for some communities who are experiencing, you know, increased pricing in fuel. But what we saw, you know, where you had individuals who said they were the voice of all of the people, you know, stopping, you know, nurses going to work. I chair the board of SAGE Advocacy, the National Independent Advocacy for Older People. Some of our advocates couldn't get to clients, older people who needed to be visited, you know, without producing ID. Where are we? So the language and the literacy of hybrid, we need to understand. And I'll just conclude on one point. We also need literacy around defence, because we're not, in this jurisdiction, good at talking about defence in terms of its general framework, but also its relationship with resilience, its relationship with sovereignty, its relationship with an insurance premium. I always said our defence forces are part of the bedrock of the institutions of our sovereignty, of the institutions that provide for civil society, where people are free, where the institutions of the state function, where the market thrives, and where the vulnerable are protected. But that sovereign base is underwritten by your defence forces.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, we might go to our audience now. So we might group questions. I've got two in the front row. I've got two in the front here, so I might go to over here, and then there's a lady in the back there, Kieran, after. You're happy with a bunch of questions? We'll take it in twos.
No, Brother Khan. I'm just a member of the Institute here in Dublin. I have a question basically for the Irish members of the panel. Last December, or in the winter of last year, Poland ordered 3 submarines from Sweden to protect their exclusive economic zone. Their exclusive economic zone is 1/10 of their landmass. Should we in Ireland be considering or actually ordering similar types of equipment to protect our exclusive economic zone through which much international commerce now passes? And I know that submarines don't seem to be on the agenda, but I suggest that if the government were serious about building up the attractiveness of the defence forces, that would be a statement in itself. And I'm just curious to know, is this even being considered?
Thanks, Donald. John, we actually might take threes because I saw a lot of hands. So there was a lady at the back there with glasses, and then we might.
Thank you. I'm Dawn Clancy. I'm also a member here at the Institute. I have a question for Mark. In the news recently, there's news that the Trump administration is dismantling these deep ocean monitoring networks. It's the Ocean Observatories Initiative. And you mentioned the ocean and how critical it is to understanding warming. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that. What kind of impact will that have going forward? It's a loss of some critical science. And then I also have a question for Jessica and Tony, talking about the Baltic Sea. Could you give us a sense of just how often these attacks occur? Because when in the news, you'll hear about a wayward drone, dropping off into Romania or Poland, but to hear a little bit more about just how frequently these attacks take place. And then also, Tony, you said something about it's actually, or maybe it was Jessica, actually commercial ships that are either linked to Russia or some other actor linked to Russia that are cutting cables. If you could speak a little bit more about that. And when you say commercial, do you mean like a ship just carrying coffee beans? Okay.
We'll take one more in this batch of questions. I can see there's, Cian, I want to make sure you get your steps in. So this is one question back there. Don't worry, we'll get to you.
Hi, I'm Ilaria from the TEPSA team in Brussels. My question is to do more with the governance of these global commons, so Arctic, sea, and space. I was wondering, considering the EU is sometimes signatory as observatory status or whatever they call the role at the time, but they're mainly negotiated between sovereign states. So I guess my question would be, how do you see these governance frameworks evolving in the next years while these global commons become more critical to our security? And what do you think the Irish presidency should do in this regard, if anything? And how can the EU ensure it has a seat at this table when the time comes and has a unified voice with different interests? Thank you.
Thanks so much. So we've got submarines, dismantling of deep ocean monitoring, how often are incidents happening in the Baltics, and governance of global commons. So who would anyone like to pick up on any of these themes?
I don't know, maybe I begin on the capability question that the first question referenced. I would say when you come to thinking the maritime security of each country, maybe one disadvantage I started off with when I took on this role was there was no other country's maritime security I could just copy and paste and put Ireland's name on. That's not the nature of the maritime domain. Every maritime strategy is very specific to the country's geography, the risks and threats associated with it, and all sorts of other factors to consider. So there's no what works for one country won't work for another. That said, one of the strategic objectives, kind of in the first strategic objective in our new strategy, is about defending our maritime domain, and that includes increasing the capabilities of our defence forces. And our initial focus is on increasing that maritime domain awareness. Again, we're starting from a low base, and this is a kind of a key area to begin. So funding things like military radar, sonar capabilities, and so on is a kind of a very key initial step that's being taken. In addition, my department is working on a capability development plan for the defence forces out to 2040 at the moment. Hope it will be published quite soon. This is a very considerable, substantial piece of work that's taken place, led by my department in cooperation with the defence forces, to find out exactly what it is, capabilities that are needed, and have a plan through the next decade. And hopefully kind of funding will flow to support that from government to achieve this. And I would say, again, from a budgetary perspective, again, Ireland is at a very low base. Everyone knows the percentage of our GDP spent on defence is the lowest in Europe. It's considerably lower than the next highest, I would say. But the government is taking this seriously and recently announced a capital increase to our budget of 55%, for example. So yes, we're starting with a low base. But the government does recognise it and it's taking steps to try and ameliorate that.
Super. Thanks, Margaret. I might go to you, Mark, just on the deep ocean monitoring, and we might also, if you can, comment.
Well, just to touch on the submarine, I think it's a legitimate question. I attended the inaugural Defence Security Association conference yesterday here in Dublin. It's a new institution which is about, I suppose, promoting research collaboration with defence tech sector. And there are remarkable developments in terms of autonomous technologies in the submarine space. In fact, companies like Catix Ocean, just out in Naas, would have some of the most cutting-edge AI, machine learning technologies on the front end of autonomous underwater vehicles. They work with Kongsberg actually very closely, and they'll probably kill me for saying it. They also work with the US. So I have a sense, and I did mention the word of the dash for trash. We have to be very careful from the base we're coming in that we don't go after ugly babies, because they're ugly babies. And what I mean by that is that some behemoths have quite sophisticated technologies that actually are they're old technology. We need to be very smart in terms of how we invest. Now, I look at what the opportunity for this state is to look at our tech economy, to look at how we can leverage where technology is going. You look at the way the revolution in military affairs in Ukraine is going. It's drones that are driving the actual battle space there. It's drones that are taking out tanks and conventional capabilities. And I see it's going to be the same in our jurisdiction into the future. The acquisition of knowledge will be through autonomous vehicles, subsurface, on the surface, and in space, and the air. And that's a careful point. And back to your point, I absolutely am dismayed at what's happening in terms of some of the decisions on the US side, the dismantling of the actual, I suppose, monitoring system, which is critical to monitoring ocean temperatures. And I raised a point earlier on with regards to ocean being a critical stabilization for climate. Some of the evidence we're seeing now in terms of the acceleration in ocean temperatures are frightening because they're outside the models. And so if you take away a monitoring system that actually gives you that evidence, then we're going to miss critical points that are coming along the track. There are more recent papers on the Atlantic meridional overturning current, which actually are quite worrying in terms of something that's, some of the models suggested was going to come in the next century, could actually come in this century. And if that's stopped, we would have a complete change in environment here. The last time I was in St. John's in Newfoundland, the entrance was blocked by an iceberg. Dublin is 300 miles further north of St. John's in Newfoundland. The only reason we have this beautiful environment today is because of the Atlantic Gulf Stream, and that is under threat. And not only is the administration looking at, I suppose, stopping this ocean monitoring system, it's also been challenging the Keeling curve, which has been in existence in 1958 in Hawaii. That started measuring carbon in the atmosphere when I was born. I think the first measurement was 313 parts per million. We're now at nearly 430 parts per million. And we talk about net zero. We get to net zero probably maybe at 500 parts per million. And all the indications are we will be well beyond 2 degrees when it comes to net zero. So net zero is not the solution. We have to get back down to where we are here. So I've gone on a small bit.
Jessica, looks like you want.
Yeah, if I can just tag on to the climate issue there. So let's not forget climate change when we speak about maritime security. As part of the ReArm Europe debates in early 2025, members of Parliament, the European Parliament, voiced concern that all this talk about security and defense would kind of neglect or come at the expense of the green agenda. So globally, the UN adopted the BBNJ 3 years ago. And where we are on implementation, I don't know because I don't follow that file. On a European level, we have the European Ocean Pact, climate change and marine pollution, also focus on the EU Maritime Security Strategy, which was updated 3 years ago. So when we speak about maritime security, you also need to talk about the health of our oceans. And I just put it out there to the Irish Presidency and MFF negotiations when we're talking about security. Let's not forget climate change as part of that. But on the Baltic Sea, I would just like to put some perspective. Globally, there are about 200 cable cuts a year. And most of them are anchors and fishing trawlers that damage cables by accident. So there's a question about intention here. And we have seen incidents, of course, in the Baltic Sea. And then again, I want to get back to legal finish, which is so difficult. I'm a legal anthropologist, and I look at the implementation of law of the sea, so how state actors are implementing the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and related legal frameworks. And legal finish is super difficult. Easy in cases of piracy, difficult when it comes to cable cuts. So this is really an issue. Finland tried to bring a case before its courts, but had to reject the case because of lacking jurisdiction. The question of global governance, I hear two things. So global governance, the one thing is how is the state of multilateralism in the world? And the other one is how is security at sea based on maritime law enforcement governance? And I think you're talking about multilateralism perhaps, which is of course ailing these years. But what we're seeing, you mentioned that Ireland is now part of the Nordic-Baltic group plus. Not NB and then plus. Denmark is part of the NB8. And we're seeing more and more of these minilateral fora for governance, which is very understandable. We have to get together with like-minded partners to get going on things. We have the JEF, NordDefco in a Danish context, where we're now getting together with our Nordic brothers and sisters. Well, we have for a while, but now we're strengthening that cooperation in the light of transatlantic relations and the problems in NATO. But it's also a bit of a paradox, because we're trying to protect ourselves against the erosion of institutions, the very institutions that we are eroding ourselves by making these minilateral fora. So there's a paradox there that we need to deal with somehow.
Tony, I'll let you come in as well. How often are we seeing cuts? How concerned should we be?
So in the maritime domain, we've seen 5 incidents since 2023, with a total of 14 pipelines and cables being cut. But it's not just in the maritime domain. Russia's hybrid warfare against us is much, much broader. So, for example, in the air domain, we see roughly somewhere between 120 to 150 illegal flying activities in international airspace, but close to our borders, and requiring a response from NATO fighter aircraft. And we see about 4 incursions into our airspace every year in Estonia. But then you also have disinformation actions, you have economic actions, you have migrants being pushed against our borders. I mean, it's a very, very broad picture. And a couple of general points is, it's not just the frontline states. This is Europe-wide. I mean, everybody is seeing these kinds of attacks. Nobody is immune. And the second broader point would be, it's not necessarily just about numbers, but it's about impact as well. Some events can have a disproportionate impact. And what is Russia trying to do here? I mean, we don't really know, but a number of things you might speculate about. It's trying to sow uncertainty and fear amongst our populations. It's trying to demonstrate that supporting Ukraine is going to have consequences. It's trying to demonstrate that our own governments can't keep us safe and protected. And, as I said, individual incidents can have a really big impact in all of those areas. Can I just talk about, I mean, I know the question wasn't directed at me, but can I cheekily answer the capability question as well?
Absolutely.
I mean, simply to make the point that I think it would be prohibitively expensive to acquire capability for a single country to take on this job. In the Baltic Sea at the moment, we have a lot of NATO naval vessels floating around, and we still have cable cutting incidents. The Baltic Sea is not that big. I mean, compared to your own coastlines, it's not that big at all. And so again, this is a question for cooperation. Cooperation in acquisition, and cooperation in operations. And we need to find the frameworks that's possible for us as NATO, no question.
Mark, I know you want to come back and just on the Lara's question.
On the issue of governance, I can make a plug. I have a book coming out in October about the ocean, and it's called Blue Heart. And I call it the ocean being the blue heart of nature. But my point, one of the points I say is we have a raft of legislation, international institution, legislation laws that are not enforced, that are not implemented. So I suggested a platform for defence, security, control and enforcement so that we have a more progressive, I suppose, activity in areas of ocean space that may well be high seas, that may well be within our sovereign jurisdiction. But we can't have laws that we just put out and then put them on the shelf and not enforce them. Now, there is probably a gap to be closed in terms of giving the powers to coast guards, to militaries, and to other state actors to actually be more proactive in terms of enforcement of that legislation. And there is probably a requirement to tidy up legislation so that it captures, if you like, rogue actors like those who are pushing shadow fleets and that. But I do think there is a need for more proactive, I suppose, activity in areas such as the oceans. And it doesn't stop in terms of hybrid trade. It's about illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, which is a huge problem internationally.
Thanks, Mark. Just for the next round of questions, I saw a couple of hands. We might take even 4 questions. The other thing I might point out as well is we've actually had a very deep discussion about maritime security, but I think we are supposed to talk about other domains and probably European security more generally. So we'd be really interested in kind of broadening that conversation out a little bit. So I might go, Cian, there's a question here in the front from John.
Thanks very much indeed. John O'Brennan from Maynooth University. Thank you firstly to all of our speakers for really terrific insights. And my question is about Ireland's upcoming presidency of the EU and about the challenge of facing down Russian provocations and what the nature of those provocations might be. This is going to be a presidency like no other. The last time we held the presidency, it was prior to the Russian invasion of Crimea and the Donbass in 2013, happens a year or so later. Jessica will know from the recent Danish presidency about the kind of provocations we're talking about. We also saw this last November, remember, when a number of drones were spotted over Dublin Bay as President Zelensky's plane was coming into Dublin. Needless to say, if anything had happened to him and his team, it would have been a reputational disaster for Ireland. So my question, I guess, principally to Margaret and to Mark is, are we really prepared for what is to come? And the question is partly based on a sense that the Russians are now categorically losing in Ukraine. And to me, that makes them more dangerous, more prepared to take actions that they would otherwise not be prepared to take because they've got less to lose. So how prepared are we? And in a context where the Russians see us as the underbelly, the weak underbelly of European security, going back to what Cian mentioned earlier, the territorial waters incidents and others in recent years. So are we ready for a challenge that may be different in scale from anything we've seen previously?
Cheers, Sean. There's another question here in the front, Jacob, who was very patient.
Thank you, and thank you for an excellent panel. I think the discussion so far on the hybrid reality is really a fantastic illustration of the wider issue of a kind of key challenge for European security and defense. And I mean, Russia has been mentioned a lot. US and the actions by the United States has also been mentioned to kind of affect us. I'd maybe like to add that some of the vessels have also had Chinese origins, the polar bear, for instance. I think we see footprints from not only Russia here, which kind of leads me to the point that was made yesterday by those who made recommendations to the Irish presidency. That is to not only think EU, but also Europe. So now NB8++, NATO has been mentioned. So to the panel, and maybe particularly to the presidency upcoming, how do you see the interplay in a division of labor here as we go forward on not only on maritime security and on wider defense and security for the European Union, and how do you intend to kind of drive that, and what do others on the panel think EU should do there? Which actually also leads me, apropos your wider question, to the fact that the new European security strategy is supposed to be launched, and that is, I suppose, something that the Irish presidency will have to welcome and essentially implement. So what do you expect from that? Thank you.
Thanks so much. There's a hand, Cian, at the very back there that's been up for a while.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
So I was the head of the UN in Montenegro when it became independent, and the relevance of that will become obvious in a second. At the time of independence, there was an aluminium plant which was responsible for about 45% of the GDP of Montenegro, and you'll never guess who bought it. Oleg Deripaska. And at the time of independence, the Montenegrins also announced that they were going to join the EU, which it seems 28 they will do. But the Minister of Foreign Affairs said, I think to Tony Connolly in a quote, that he said, if Deripaska remains in control of the Rusal, of the CAP plant, Combinat Aluminium, through Rusal, not only will he decide what type of car I drive, he'll tell me what color it will be. So I think there's a aspect of non-military interference, and we're feeling the pressure of that. You saw the report that came from Ahnish Lumina from the management there, and the threats were veiled, but not very well. I want to know what you think about that economic threat inside our own borders. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, Cian, we have one more question up here from Michael Patton.
Thank you. And I'm just actually going to wrap some of the comments that I heard. But I guess the fundamental question listening to this is the whole emphasis on the asymmetrical nature of what we're dealing with. And one question that would be posed is whether the European Union or Europe plus way of working, of policy formulation, of planning, of strategy, of multilateralism is actually an anchor on progress against a very, very real threat. And if we take the scenario analysis that the Ukraine response by taking the war to Moscow rather than containing it in its own borders has actually had a significant effect on the balance of probability, but made Russia more dangerous. Are we sitting and talking and not making progress while the threat becomes much more apparent? And does Europe need a different policy response?
So we'll go to that. We'll go to our panel, and then I realize we're about 6 minutes left. So we might, if we can do, so just conscious of our time here. So Mark, I might go to you quickly first.
Yeah, I think just on the threats and are we prepared? Like I obviously was very interested in that near miss with the Zelensky flight, and at the same time I saw people calling that we didn't have the wherewithal. I can't comment on that because I'm not serving anymore. But I would say sometimes no action is the right decision. If there's a clear and present danger, then you have to make that call. And I don't know the decisions made and the command on the ground. That happened in international water, was outside our territorial waters. So it would have been a brave decision to start engaging with that, and the Zelensky flight had gone through. So actually I admire whoever was weapons tight on the night, because they had wherewithal to engage. They could have engaged with 20mm cannon or even smaller arms, and it probably was the right decision as things turned out. But on the issue of capabilities, Margaret, I'll leave it to you. But I do know, and I do hear a lot of narrative in terms of moving quickly to acquire the appropriate capabilities. But we won't have total. There's always risk, and I do agree with your point. I do worry that the actual way the actual Ukraine war is evolving, that it is driving towards the threat of a diversionary or something. I suppose, happening elsewhere, simply to divert away from what's happening there, whereby the institution or Putin is being weakened. And then on EU and NATO, I sat on the committee in Brussels for 6 years. For me, it's completely compatible that you have close alignment between the EU institutions and NATO. NATO has extraordinary capabilities. There are aspects, obviously, that Europe itself will have to replicate that perhaps in the past were underwritten by the US, which now appear no longer to be guaranteed. And I think the ship is moving in the right direction on that side. But I think there is a wonderful, I suppose, symmetry between the EU and all the arrows it has in its quiver with regards to diplomatic, humanitarian, economic, and other levers it can bring to bear complementing with, the more kinetic capabilities that NATO has, and then gaps being filled with regards to stronger EU institutions in terms of defence and security. That's the way it has to go forward. I worked with NATO, I served in Afghanistan. It's completely compatible to be not a member of NATO, but actually serve as a partner. And I think the same kind of arrangements can progress into the future and on Auchinish. For me, that's a question of evidence. It's also a very political question, so I wouldn't comment on it. I can't comment on it, but I hear your point loud and clear.
Great. Margaret, I might go to you next.
I suppose, well, on that question of the presidency, I think cooperation is going to be a kind of key word Ireland will be using this 6 months ahead. I think we've always worked closely with other countries, and I think when it comes to security and defence matters, obviously we have to acknowledge that this is a national matter for countries, but there's opportunities for greater cooperation and collaboration between everyone when we're facing common threats, common risks. Also, that I think the other key word is partnership. I think structured engagement between the EU, NATO, non-EU countries in our neighbourhood is another key way of working together and a way of working on that cooperation beyond the EU as well. So no one country can deal with these hybrid complex threats that we're facing. So I think these watchwords that I think Ireland has always been interested in are more important than ever. I'd also maybe touch a little bit on the importance of resilience and preparedness too. Naturally things will always happen. It mightn't be a hostile hybrid threat. It could be climate issue or something that will have a massive impact on ourselves. So by making our countries more resilient as possible, making the EU as a whole more resilient to what may come, I think will improve our overall outlook for the future. So I'm proud to say one of my previous roles was in the Office of Emergency Planning in my department, where we led on cross-government preparation for the Critical Entities Resilience Directive. And certainly from an Irish perspective, this was a very sea change in outlook and how we deal with this issue. My department recently launched another strategy, on the national approach to the resilience of critical entities. And I think this is going to become an ever important issue across the EU. How do we increase our resilience in all aspects of our society in all our different sectors to deal with these threats that are coming towards us? And then maybe just briefly mention the drone issue. Obviously, security kind of on our island is first and foremost the role of our police forces, the Garda Síochána and our Department of Justice. But naturally, ourselves in defence will do everything to support that. And that includes acquiring new counter-drone technology and so on, so that defence forces, if they're called upon to support, are as prepared and as capable as possible to provide that greater support.
Super. Thanks, Margaret. Jessica.
Thank you. Yeah, on the question about whether the EU needs a new policy regime, I think the EU was trained to run a marathon in sunshine, and now we have to do a sprint in thunder. But I think the EU in many ways is fit for purpose, at least on a strategic and institutional level. We have this bouquet of policies, right, and a bit of a policy forest where streamlining and institutional interlinkages are necessary. But we do have all the elements, I think, in place to be resilient. On a capability and operational side, that's different from the strategic and institutional side. There are still issues. The European Defence Agency is definitely making tangible results on European capabilities and dialogue between public and the private sector, but still defense and security is a national prerogative, and there is some sort of, and we have NATO as well, so there is some sort of a tension there that needs to be worked out. The European Court of Auditors criticized the lack of sort of oversight in terms of procurement, and there are issues with military mobility across European. I mean, lots of capability issues still, but I think on the strategic and institutional side, we don't need more. We need to streamline and avoid fragmentation.
Tony.
Yeah, on the question of the Russian threat, I mean, yes, if Russia is defeated, it may well lash out. But the other point of view is that if Russia wins, it will be emboldened. So, I mean, Russia's going to be the bad guy, whatever the outcome of the war in Ukraine, and will be for some time. And this is the real threat. I mean, we've talked a lot about hybrid warfare, and of course, this is not a nice thing to experience. But the real threat is the existential one, that Russia will take a bite of territory somewhere, maybe not in NATO, in Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, Svalbard, Baltic states. You know, this is the threat that we're dealing with, and we're certainly not moving quick enough to deal with that threat. People are talking about Russia being ready to attack us as early as 2027, 2030 at the latest, and we need to accelerate our response. And I don't think that's necessarily an institutional question. It's really a question of will and money, and will to spend that money. So we need to kind of somehow persuade our populations that this is the direction we need to move in. On EU NATO, ESS has been, I think, remarkably well kept behind closed doors. I haven't heard very much at all about it. But I think since the start of the war, we've seen this kind of evolving grand bargain between NATO and the EU. It's not a formal thing by any means, but this emerging idea that NATO will fight the wars and the EU will provide the capability to fight those wars through the instruments it has available to it and through financing. And that's what I hope the ESS would cement, at least for this next period of the few years that are to come.
Thanks so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I would love to do another round of questions. Unfortunately, we're over time, and I want to make sure everyone can have a cup of tea or a coffee just to kind of improve their mood.